live stream and all set to go. Yeah. All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the July 2022 edition of the MyMangrove, or the Malaysian Mangrove Research Alliance and Network Monthly Discourse. And as you all know, the one attending today would surely know that the issue we're touching today is plastic. You know, I mean, we see plastic everywhere on the beaches, yeah, on our seagrasses area, in the ocean, in particular, in our rivers, and particularly convenient is for them to be stuck, yeah, among the roots in mangroves. So it is a very, very, very critical issue, and it does not only affect ecological system in the mangrove. It is now entering the food system, the trophic systems, yeah, of our seafood, and there are evidence that plastic, microplastic or nanoplastic, are entering our body now, yeah, our blood system. So to discuss about this issue, we are so happy, we are so proud, and we are so honored actually to have Professor Moritz Mu from Swinburne University of Technology, Sarawak, to discuss this topic with us. And thank you very much, Professor Moritz, for your time. And we will have an exclusive presentation from Professor Moritz, about half an hour to 45 minutes, and then we will have another perhaps another half an hour of discussion. Yeah? He's happy to answer questions relating to this topic, and also perhaps to spark or to trigger some further discussion later on, yeah, or further collaboration, particularly in research in Malaysia or elsewhere, yeah, throughout the tropics. So yeah, today is your chance, yeah, to also listen to Professor Moritz on some of his findings, some of his suggestions, and perhaps some of potential research, yeah, relating to solving this issue. Yeah? Perhaps we cannot solve the whole problem in the world, but who knows? Yeah, Professor Moritz, you have the chance now, yeah, to become the champion, and we are all here to back you up. Yeah. So without further ado, I reckon you may begin your presentation now, and yeah, the screen is yours. Thank you very much again, Professor Moritz, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Audrey, for the very nice introduction and providing me with the opportunity to save the world. Yes, so I want to talk a bit about plastics today in coastal ecosystems and mangroves. I understand this is the mangrove network, so I try and provide some mangrove information as well. But my initial background is bacteria, so I also end up with a little story on bacteria. And I subtitled this A Story of Despair and Hope. So there's a lot of bad news, but there's also some good news in there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about macroplastics, the larger pieces. Then I dive into the microplastics a little bit and end up with the bacteria and the plastics. And you can see on the right this beautiful picture of the place I live in Sarawak, in Borneo. And you can already see the coastal area is quite flooded with a lot of sediment, and we can't detect the plastic yet, not the small pieces, but I think in future maybe this may be possible as well. All right, I want to start with a disclaimer. I'm not a mangrove expert, and I've been asked to talk in the mangrove network, so I'm not really working as particularly or exclusively on mangroves. I am a coastal and riverine person, so we work a lot in rivers and coastal waters, and obviously the mangroves are part of that ecosystem, and so some of our studies are taking place in mangroves, and it seems that in recent years more and more of our work focuses on mangroves. So I was happy to talk about mangrove parts, but I'm not a mangrove expert. So what we do in the last few years is mainly working on peat draining rivers. So Sarawak is blessed with a lot of peat, and we've been looking at the issue of land use change and greenhouse gases, and most of our work has been trying to investigate the impacts of land use change on water quality and river quality. So a lot of our initial publications are on greenhouse gas and peatlands, rivers, and coastal waters. We are recently doing more and more work with remote sensing, and I was tempted to put something inside, but I cut it out because I already have too much content. But our remote sensing work is also moving into the mangrove area, and we're going to look at carbon fluxes in mangroves. So there's another topic we can discuss later on. But I think one that is quite interesting, and if you want to talk about it, Azani is in the crowd. We are also engaging more and more with communities and using a gamification approach. So the engagement with communities is another big part that we are doing recently, in recent years. So when we do our surveys, we see all this plastic. Audrey already mentioned it earlier. We have all these beach surveys and they're full of plastic, littered with plastic. And that's really where our initial interest in plastic sparked. Firstly, obviously, we want to clean it up, but then we also thought about, well, we clean it up once and then we come back the next week, it's all there again. So we have to do something larger to try and tackle this issue. And this is a beach which is 5 minutes away from my house. So it's not something I want to see every day, but unfortunately we do. And we see this in many places, which is not a big surprise, really, if you look at the amount of plastics that we use in our society. So if you compare with the time, if you compare with the time that our parents were children, they used about 1.5 million tons of plastic in a year. And in our time nowadays, we produce about 500 million tons of plastic every year. So that's over 300 times more plastic in just 70 years. So it's an incredible increase. And it's not really surprising that a lot of this plastic ends up in other places as well. It's really a sheer explosion of plastic use in our daily lives. Unfortunately, Malaysia is one of the famous countries in terms of litter waste management. So we are labeled as one of the top 10 worst plastic offenders in the world. So we have a big issue with plastic waste management. And I saw that Rita is also in the crowd, and I think she's addressing this issue on a national level. So we are one of the world leaders really in plastic pollution or in not dealing well with our plastic waste. But we're not alone. Our region is quite unique. We have China, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. All these countries really have an issue with bringing the plastic from the household into the waste management systems. And a lot of this plastic then gets contributed into the environment as a waste and pollution. So we have all these unfortunate newspaper reports where we see plastic bags and crocodile stomachs, which are basically just dying from too much plastic inside. We have, obviously, everybody's seen these pictures of turtles who are caught in plastic nets and fishing nets. So there's a lot of impact on our environment and our wildlife. And unfortunately, the mismanaged plastic waste really is the main source of plastic into the ocean. So if you look at the amount of plastic in the oceans or in ocean systems, 80% of the plastic comes from land. And it could be quite easily avoided if we were to manage our plastic better. Yeah? But we don't do that particularly well. And all this mismanaged, uncollected plastic waste ends up in coastal ecosystems and then ultimately in the ocean. And the numbers are quite staggering. We have about 4 to 12 million tons of plastic waste in just 2010 alone. That's many years ago. And if you look at the exponential increase of plastic use, there's a much larger number nowadays. Surprisingly, this is a bit off topic, but surprisingly, we actually only see 3 to 4% of the expected plastic waste in the oceans. A lot of the plastic waste that we expect in the ocean is actually unaccounted for. We don't quite know where it goes. So that's another big research topic. And in terms of mangroves, mangroves are unfortunate to be situated around countries which have big issues with plastic management, plastic waste management. You can see the countries highlighted in color code. So everything turning reddish is having an issue with plastic waste. And then you see in green the coastal lines lined up with mangroves. And a lot of the countries which are quite dark in color, red, orange, dark purple, dark orange, also host to mangrove ecosystems. So there's a direct threat to mangroves from the mismanaged waste. And I want to highlight Australia, because you can see that there's a lot of mangrove around, but there's very little mismanaged plastic waste. Yeah, so there is a way to deal with plastic, and I think there's a way to protect our mangroves better by just managing the plastic better. So I think it's quite a good example of how we can improve in the region. It's not only the mismanaged plastic, a lot of the plastic then gets into the rivers and gets flushed into the rivers. And there's another study also last year, which assessed the mangroves' distance to plastic polluting rivers. And literally every mangrove in the world is close to a plastic carrying polluting river. So that's really quite not a nice environment, not a nice neighbor to be. So you are surrounded by countries, you're growing in countries which are mismanaging their waste, which have rivers full of plastic. And again, Australia is a shining example there where it can be done a bit better, I think. Yeah. So I think managing plastic, the larger plastic pieces can be a big part of the solution. Once these plastic gets into the mangrove systems, the larger pieces, Audrey already mentioned some of the impacts. You have all this smothering of trees, the roots and the little thermophores sticking out. We have all these layers on the sediment. Obviously, you inhibit gas exchange, you interfere with biogeochemical processes, you bring in other toxicants that are coming from the plastics, you may damage the plants, and obviously that has a long-term impact on the health of the mangrove ecosystems. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a mangrove expert, so I had to search for the impacts on mangroves. I did find not so many studies, surprisingly, but I did find a few. A lot of them are talking about the amount of plastics, or there's more and more studies on plastic occurrence in mangroves, but very few actually talk about impact on the health. What I found is that plastic is obviously everywhere, and it's a well-known fact that we find it in every place in the world already. And in mangroves, you quite often find them also buried in the upper layers of the sediment. So it has been around for a while, and then in there it can create quite anoxic conditions, which is obviously bad for the health of the roots and the trees. But the questions posed in these papers were, does plastic actually kill the mangrove? And what's the implication on the health? So there is a general negative tone that the plastic debris has an impact on the mangrove's health. Yeah, so all parameters of health were affected. And in another study, they also showed that this prolonged exposure to plastic or suffocation by plastic caused death on potential leaf loss of the mangroves. But there was some good news, which I thought was quite surprising. They did experiments with different percentages of plastic waste and plastic exposure. So when they covered up to 50% of the roots in plastic, the trees were quite happy still. They were quite happily continuing to grow, and they only started to suffer when the plastic coverage became more than 50%. So when they reached 70, 100%, then they obviously started to die. But until then, they were quite resilient. So there seems to be quite a lot of resilience in the mangroves system to deal with plastic waste. Yeah. I think a troublesome news is that all the studies mentioned a lot of plastic waste and a lot of areas covered in quite high percentages. And if you look at the numbers of plastic use, it's not likely to get less. We are going to have more and more plastic entering the systems, and then we have more damaged mangroves. So while there's, I think, some good news that they are quite capable to deal with the bigger pieces of plastic, there is also the continuous threat of more and more intake or input into the systems. So I think if you want to talk about management and when you want to treat these kind of mangrove ecosystems or coastal ecosystems, I think it's always important to know what are the trends, what are the numbers, what are the hotspots, where do you focus your efforts, or what is actually an expected number. So I looked for some of the methods to count microplastics, and one that we are starting to develop or use now in Sarawak is the use of drones. We import this tech from Japan, from our colleagues. And basically we can fly the drone and create a 3-dimensional model of an area. And then we can apply an algorithm, an artificial intelligence algorithm, to detect and count plastics in our particular area of interest. So the algorithm detects plastic pieces and then counts them. And more importantly, I think also calculates the volume of the plastic waste. So it's not just numbers, it's actually a quantifiable volume of plastic in our particular area of interest. So I think having a system that can monitor numbers and can detect numbers is going to be quite useful to find out where we want to do some action and where we want to focus our efforts. There are obviously issues that all this plastics is distributed by rivers and oceans into all our neighboring countries. So even if we clean up our beach, as I mentioned earlier, next week it's going to be dirty again. So it is a transboundary issue. And I think we have people in the call who are working on this on the national level. And there's a big movement for national, international plastic treaty. And I think that is quite important that all the countries take action together, but there seems to be quite a lot of interest and action to be taken at international levels. We have some other tech solutions on a larger scale, like the Great Ocean Cleanup, which I'm sure you've all heard of, where we have people collecting the big rubbish waste, mainly from the oceans. And I think dealing with the larger plastic issues is a challenge that can be addressed with enough goodwill and enough funding and effort by everybody. Yeah. So I think it's quite complex. It's not just going there and collecting the waste. It includes economy, it includes society, it includes a lot of educational efforts, it includes political frameworks, and obviously a lot of science to deal with the uptake into the food web and so on. But I think if you combine efforts, and that seems to be happening, then I think this bigger issue of the larger plastic particles and larger plastic pieces might be solved in future. But as I was asked to talk about another issue, there's a smaller, or in this case, bigger problem maybe, is that big macroplastics don't stay big macroplastics for too long in the environment. Yeah, so they break into a lot of smaller microplastics. So if you take this drinking water bottle, for example, one of these bottles breaks into 10 billion tiny pieces, which is quite a big number already, all still plastic. And if you then take this, for example, in the case of England, England uses about 7.7 billion water bottles of this type every year, on a yearly basis. So if you calculate these numbers together, you get an astonishing number of 7.7 quintillion tiny pieces of microplastics every year, just from drinking water bottles alone. Yeah? So this is just a tiny fraction of all the plastic that we use. But this tiny fraction already produces a mind-staggering amount of microplastics on a yearly basis. And they cannot just be filtered out. It's a massive technological effort. And they just stay in the environment for a very, very long time. Yeah. So a colleague from Japan, Atsuhiko, has made a nice little study about the amount of plastic entering the system and the amount of plastic being found. So he has this model simulation about plastic entering the area from fisheries or from rivers, and then also the fragmentation of plastics. So you can see the river Rhine-derived plastic is in blue. So the inputs come from all the known rivers. It's all based on models and numbers. And then the yellow ones are the larger pieces breaking down into smaller pieces. And this one runs over just a time frame of 1 year. But you can see that the yellow pieces become more and more. And obviously, if you run this for a long time, you will find microplastics everywhere. And there are quite a few initiatives around which have begun looking at global data sets of microplastics. And these are all based on more or less citizen science projects, in this case, where people collect a water sample and then send it to the lab, and the lab analyzes it for microplastics. And you can see that in all these different places where people have collected water and shipped it there, all these places have microplastics. So really, you find these tiny pieces everywhere. Yeah. And in some cases, there are studies where they have found 60 times more plastic than phytoplankton. And that is obviously very sad for primary production. And if you're a fish or a little krill or shrimp in that kind of water and you're looking for food and all you find is microplastics, you're not going to survive for very long. And you're going to get quite full of plastics very fast. So the problem is that these plastics are still plastics. Yeah? So microplastic is still a plastic particle and is still around for 50, 100, 400 years, depending on the type of plastic. So they're not necessarily gone, they're just smaller. They're just around for many, many more years. And they're also usually not particularly biodegradable. So they don't necessarily all disappear too fast. And what we have in terms of impacts on the larger plastics is the same on the scale of microplastics. You have a very nice large surface area. They're exposed to light in the ocean. They're there for a long time. They have a really nice surface chemistry where we have lots of polar groups which attract pollutants such as sunscreen or POPs and so on, all kinds of heavy metals. Everything likes to attach to them. And for bacteria, they become little surfaces like little sediment particles, and they sit on them and they travel with the microplastics. Obviously, if you are eating them, this is not the best food. You could have a better nutrition. If it enters a lot of the food chains, it goes up the food chain. It also can carry a lot of potentially pathogenic bacteria with it. So if you're coming from a river surrounded by factories, you bring a lot of pollutants with you and potentially harmful bacteria. You go down the river, you enter the mangroves, you enter the coral reefs, you bring all these beautiful side products with you and then deposit in the sediment and spread all your good to the rest. So there's a lot of down the line impacts of all the things that are attached to microplastics. Yeah, so microplastics acting as taxis, more or less, for many, many other harmful substances. And a lot of these are shown in the lab quite bad. So we have a few studies here, which are just an example of many, many others. There's some on heavy metals on the top left. There's some on persistent organic pollutants on the top right. We have some which impact the coral growth on the bottom left. And then we have the pathogenic bacteria on the bottom right. So a lot of these studies exist, really thousands of studies. And unfortunately, they are mostly quite damaging. All of them show the impact. All of them show the potential to do impact. And the only good thing really so far about it is that most of these are lab-based. Yeah, many of them are just in the lab and not so many in the field. But the ones who are in the field show a slightly more nuanced response and often have slightly lower concentrations of plastics. But if you increase the concentrations, a lot of these have quite bad impacts. So I mentioned the food chain earlier, and if you are a little shrimp and you eat this little plastics and then you get eaten by a crab and the crab gets eaten by a fish, then if we catch this fish and have our nice dinner, our seafood dinner, then obviously we are incorporating and biomagnifying all the plastic throughout the food chain, and in the end it ends up in us. And that's, I think, one of the biggest concerns is that we create this massive potentially dangerous reservoir of microplastics in the oceans or in the environment, really, which we cannot control anymore and which we cannot treat, really. But then ultimately we are the end consumer in most processes. So there are many studies, as I mentioned earlier, and we did one also with one of our students, and we looked at catfish because it's quite popular fish in Asia. So we exposed a catfish or several catfish to microplastics in the diet, and some of the plastics we exposed to heavy metals beforehand. So we wanted to test how do they react to plastic and how do they react to plastic that is polluted with heavy metals. Yeah? And then we tested two different types of plastic, the normal nylon kind of type and the more biodegradable plastic PLA. And our results were quite surprising. So first of all, if you have plastics in the diet, the amount of pathogenic bacteria in the fish guts increased. And if you compare the two different plastics, the one that's biodegradable has a much higher count of bacteria in the guts. And the same is true for the metals. So you have much higher metal concentrations in the fish, and you have a lot more potentially pathogenic bacteria in the fish. So we were quite surprised by the potentially more damaging profile of the biodegradable plastics, and I'm quite keen to continue looking at the biodegradable plastics. So I think the solution may not always be so straightforward. Biodegradable plastics are touted quite a lot as a potential solution, but there may be other side effects down the line which we don't really understand yet. Again, quite similar to the macroplastics, I think if you want to talk about management, you want to talk about actions, you want to talk about plans and policies, you need to also first know where they are, how many they are, what they are, and that's not so straightforward with microplastics. Macroplastics are a lot easier to count. For microplastics, usually you need a lot of expensive equipment like Raman or FTIR. And there's a new method, or a relatively new method, where we use ller and to study it. It's a bit cheaper, and I'll show you a little video in a minute. But if you look at just the amount of scientific studies in our area, in the world, you can see that there are not that many scientific papers on microplastics in our area. I admit that this is a little outdated, but it's not many more so far. So we have quite an empty data bank, baseline data for how many plastics we actually have in our waters. There's a lot of calculations, there's a lot of models, there's a lot of numbers around. So this is from a recent paper we are part of, where we talk about microplastic in Southeast Asia. So you have all these river predictions, you have all these numbers from river emissions, and then you would expect a lot of microplastics in the sea, but we don't really have proof yet. We haven't really gone there and measured that very much. And I think that's probably the first step before we can address any of the challenges. So we do measure with a method called ller. And basically what we do is take the sample and we stain it with a fluorescent dye, the ller, and then we can put that on a filter and put it under a microscope. And then we can take a picture of the filter, and we will see in a minute that the microscope, the filter then basically starts to shine, and anything that is a plastic starts to shine bright. And you see all these little shiny pieces here are all microplastics, and then we can count them, and we can at least see how many potential microplastics we have. So the next step is to then really verify if these are microplastics. So this is just a counting of potentially fluorescent particles, which are likely microplastics. But the next step is to verify that these are actually microplastics. So we do a FTIR analysis next, and then we can see how many of these are microplastics and how many are not. So on average, about 2/3 of the pieces are actually microplastics. So it's relatively accurate, and it's very fast and quite cheap to do. So we have gone out, and so I'm just going to show a few examples of work that we are currently doing. If I come back in a month, maybe I have better numbers and better analysis, but for now we just have some raw numbers. So we have gone to a cruise in Taiwan and then collected samples, as you can see on the top right there, across the South China Sea. And the numbers are quite comparable with another study from Japan, so it looks quite similar in terms of numbers. We're also working with WWF on coastal communities in Sabah. And I was hoping to get data ready, but I did not manage it on time. But we have collected quite a few samples by now from West Malaysia and from Sabah, and looked at the content of microplastics in drinking water sources of mostly coastal communities. I might share this maybe in another talk one day. And then we're also sending our students out and looking at various local beaches in Sarawak and looking at the amount of plastics we find there. So we have done the one section of Sarawak, and we find numbers also very, very different. So some areas are very clean, other areas are very, very polluted. And we are obviously now interested to find out why there's such a difference between the different sites. Yeah? And the numbers are all preliminary, but they do fit quite well with other scientific publications. And what you will see in the box at the top is that everybody reports the numbers quite differently. And that is quite a big challenge in standardizing these kind of findings. So in Singapore, we have a report of 0 to 4 items per 250 gram. Then in South Korea, we have items per square meter. In Hawaii, we have per liter, then per milliliter in the UK. So we have very different systems of how they are measured, and then we have to try and find a way to compare them. But in terms of numbers, they are within the same range in some of the cases. One area that we are trying to address now is with the drone and the microplastics is to look at a potential link between the macroplastics and the microplastics. So if we can use macroplastic, which is easier to monitor, as a predictor of microplastics. And so we have this, for example, a website, satellite product, where you can look at waste sites in the world, basically. And then you can see in this area, we have already done our microplastic surveys. And now we're going to try and look if we can correlated data we find with the drones, correlated data we find with the satellites, with the microplastics on the ground, and if there's any particular pattern or correlation between the different numbers. All right, but I'm asked to talk about mangroves. So I looked at mangrove literature and I found surprisingly stable, consistent reportings and numbers. There are very few studies again. It's only really picking up in the last 2-3 years. And I saw a study from Indonesia, which had about 30 particles per kilogram, and then another one from Singapore, which had about 30 plus particles per kilogram. This is dry sediment, so again, there's a slight difference between the two of them, but they're at least halfway comparable. You see quite high numbers in a different study in Indonesia, 92 items per square meter, so we have a different number there again, but the numbers are at least in a similar dimension, I want to say. And they all found that the outer side of the mangroves were generally higher in mangrove and microplastics than the inner side, and they all linked it to the tidal pattern. Yeah. So main sources really are, or the main plastics they find are PE and polypropylene and PET, which is a lot of them are basically waste products from tourism and from people and the runoff from the rivers, and yeah, land-based sources of plastics, which are basically just degrading and well, accumulating in the mangroves. Another source were the fishery activities. So the fishing nets were quite a big source of plastics as well, and fishing gear, yeah, generally quite high. There's very little data really. If you're interested, I recommend there's quite a nice paper out last year on microplastic pollution in mangroves. So you can see on the graph on the left, there are just a few studies on microplastics, but they're all in water, in sediment, or in biota. So very, very few really in mangroves. And you can see that they are all surrounding mangroves, but not really addressing the mangrove issue yet. But I have a feeling that a lot more studies will come in the next 2-3 years, probably. So we did go out to our own little mangrove and had a little test survey. And so you see four different samples really. You see the light blue on the left, which is a plastic bottle. And then you see the orange is a rope, and then the big green one is a plastic bag, and then the yellow one is a normal soil. So what we did was look at plastic in the mangroves, and then we collected a soil sample next to the plastic or far away from any kind of sign of plastic pollution. And then we counted the microplastics inside those samples. And you can see that in all the sites where we had plastic or larger macroplastic, the amount of microplastics in the soil was definitely higher than in the control sample. Yeah? And I think that's quite a good indication that a lot of these processes of the breakdown from macro to micro really happen on site and translate into microplastic pollution on the site. The numbers are relatively high compared to the numbers we have seen in Indonesia or Singapore. So it's not so surprising because in our beach survey, we also found quite high numbers of plastic in this particular beach. Hence we went there to see. I found one very interesting aspect about mangroves and microplastics and the impact of climate change. So with climate change, we're expecting a lot of sea level rise. And there are studies that have basically predicted that if sea level rises, the mangrove system changes and the whole muddy basin changes, and the tidal currents and the tidal flow and sand barriers all move and shift. And with that, the system prepares or is basically being prepared for a reintroduction of microplastic particles. So whatever plastic we have accumulating now and is breaking down now, in future is likely that there's even more forces of keeping that plastic inside the mangroves. So there is a threat, I think, to mangroves that we have more plastic coming from land, and whatever plastic is there and breaking down is not really leaving the system, but being reintroduced into the system over time. And then as climate change progresses, probably even more than nowadays. All right, so that's all the doom and gloom. We have a lot of bad news, and so I promised I end with some good news and some hope. So we have on these plastics, since they are such nice little surfaces, we obviously don't have only pollutants, we also have microbial life, because microbes go everywhere and dominate every biogeochemical process. So they sit on these plastics and they really take to plastic surfaces and form a ecosystem, which they have termed plastisphere. So it's very different from anything we see in the water. It's very different from anything we see on wood or glass or on soil. So really, they have distinct microbial communities that sit on these plastic pieces. Unfortunately, like most things in the tropics, we have very little knowledge. There's very little baseline data. So if we did a study and put some microplastic beads into a river for half a year, and then we looked at the microbial community on them and the gene expression on them. So we can compare the results and we can see big differences between the water and the plastics, but it's very hard to compare to other studies in the region. Most of our comparison has to be done with overseas studies. So there's definitely a lack really in studies in our planet and in our space. But there are a lot of studies on the plastisphere, and they are being touted as one of the potential solutions to actually degrade the plastics as well. Since they attach to the plastic, they find a space to live, they adapt to the plastics, and then they excrete enzymes. And some of these enzymes, such as PETAs, hydroxylase or peroxidase, they can actually break down plastics into smaller monomers. So polymers become monomers, and then these monomers can be completely degraded into their little building blocks, such as carbon dioxide, water, and so on, and then they basically disappear. So this is possible. It has been shown also in many cases already, and yeah, it's really one of the better ways of addressing plastic pollution. And there are some structures in plastic that make it quite possible. So bacteria like carbon-carbon bonds, or they're like ester and amide linkages. So we find these in polyesters quite a bit. So they're easy to degrade. They don't like aromatic groups, which we find in PETs a lot, which makes PET so hard to degrade also. So a big issue with PET recycling is the biodegradation part, because we can't break it down easily. So there are certain plastics which are more suitable for biodegradation than others, but there is a lot of scope for breaking down plastics. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this PETase, which is quite highly thought after. Okay? So in mangroves, again, very, very little research. I found one from this year, which is very, very recent. So they find basically that there's two different strategies of using either individual strains. So you find a bacterium or a fungus that lives in the mangroves and then shows potential to degrade the plastic. And then you cultivate that particular strain and grow it in large numbers and then apply it to the plastic waste, or extract the enzymes and apply those enzymes. Or another approach is to not just take one particular species, but take the whole biofilm community that sits on a particular area. So if you put a plastic bottle there, then you see what grows on them, and you take that whole community to help you degrade the plastic in all its different components. So two different strategies, and both of them are quite actively researched in the lab, but not yet really applied, I think, on a larger scale. So again, we did our own little survey in our local mangrove. It's part of a grant we started with Singapore and the UK. But it's basically what we did in our mangrove is taking those plastic samples, which I mentioned earlier, where we look at the microplastics also in the soil. So we take the plastic pieces we find in the mangroves, and then we look for bacteria that sit on these and can grow on plastic. So we only give them plastic as a carbon source to grow. So they basically only grow if they can degrade plastic. And then we isolate those. And then a second experiment, we extracted all the DNA and exposed via RAN some nanopore sequencing, some next generation sequencing, and looked at the diversity and functions as well. So on the diversity, you can see the soil sample in the bottom right in the yellow box. You can just look at the pattern. Is obviously very, very different from the other three plastic samples that we show there. Yeah? So anything that is living on the plastic has a very different community distribution or community setup makeup and then the normal natural soil. So this plastisphere is very much represented, and we find quite a few bacteria which are showing potential to do biodegradation. So we find high numbers of Erythrobacter or Rosiobacter, which are all known to be able to degrade plastics or living on plastics as well. So there's quite a high potential to find more. And we did also find I only show four different isolates which are able to grow on plastic, which we are currently analyzing the genomes from. So we have sequenced the whole genome, but now we are doing the bioinformatics part. So we found some which are related to Pseudomonas, so 2 isolates related to Pseudomonas, which are quite common as plastic degraders. So that was quite nice. And they have been shown to be active in many different types of plastics. We found one related to Acinetobacter, which can degrade oil. So oil and N-alkanes, hydrocarbons is the similar source of plastic or the similar component. So it's also not so surprising that they can degrade plastic. And our most exciting finding is a isolate related to the budding yeast, which we use in industry a lot. It's related to Saccharomyces, but has very, very little genetic similarity. So that one we are going to focus on in the next few weeks and try and understand what it is and how it does actually degrade the plastic, because there's if hardly any. There's one I think I found on yeast and plastic degradation. So yeast can be cultured and cultivated in large industrial processes, and if this works well, then there's quite a high potential to use this and upscale the production of the enzymes. So yeah, in conclusion, our microbial short little essay really just showed that a lot of plastic is in our mangroves, and luckily our bacteria are able to adapt, and I think they are really quite a good source of potentially new enzymes, or definitely a good source of future bioremediation opportunities to deal with some of the plastic that we have. So just to end, I want to just share my final thoughts. So I think there's a lot of lab-based studies, and a lot of them are quite potentially harmful. So we see a lot of worry. That's why there's also a lot of research, I think, about going into this area. But a lot of them are still really lab-based. So I think we have a lack of environmental studies, and I think we really need to have more studies in the field. Another area that needs and is also being urgently addressed, but one area that really makes it difficult to compare results is that we have no standard method yet. So looking at different studies from different countries, different areas, different results are sometimes very hard to generalize, because we have all these different methods, we have different ways of reporting them, we have different ways of staining them. So there's a lot of method development still in this area. And then I think also we have a lot of areas like ecosystems which are completely understudied. The tropics being one, really heavily understudied. But then also systems, mostly is in the surface waters, some are in the column, some are in sediment. But most of the water studies are all in the ocean, for example. There's very little on freshwater. Lakes and rivers are still very, very few studies. So there's a lot of work, I think, still to be done, and getting an accurate picture of how much plastic is actually there, and especially how much microplastics. And then I think one area that we find quite interesting, and which we are keen to explore really more, is that the promise or the false promise of biodegradable plastics. So I think it's not such a straightforward solution, and I think that there is a lot more science to be done before we can actually solve the issue of which kind of plastic to use and which kind of plastic is better for economies and for society, and which one can we bring forward. And I think the good news is that many people are tackling this issue, and there's really almost a daily new publication on plastics. We have plastics coming out really like no one's business. There's a lot of plastic research being done, and I think we are all addressing the issue from every different angle, and hopefully there's a lot more common conclusions in the next few years and solutions to the issue as well. So my final slide really is that I think we have done great damage to the Earth in very short time, and it's no surprise, it's called the Anthropocene. So I think we have really big impact on the environment, but having created that big of impact, we have the same power and the same possibility to do the same good to the environment, and I think save the planet as well. So I think we have really a unique chance to reverse a lot of the damage that we have done, and if we do it together, I think then there's I have no doubt that we can solve all these issues together. And yeah, with that, I want to thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, I look forward to discussion and future collaboration. And if you want to check out our websites, Twitter, and so on, they're all at the bottom. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for this mind-blowing. Actually, some of the photos and videos, and a lot of new things I've learned. Plastisphere, imagine that. Yeah, I think this is another legacy of our generation of the Anthropocene, I reckon. Creating this new environment or new setting, yeah, in nature. Which have this very high impact on our health. Yeah? And I like that you demonstrated that image of microplastic entering our seafood and eventually entering our body system. And there's no solution for that just yet as well. Yeah? So, and you, I think, clearly highlighted of the lack of information, synchronizing reportings, yeah, of studies and findings of plastics, macro to micro plastics in our environment. So, I mean, my first question would be, is there any initiative in between scientists working on microplastic or macroplastic? I saw there's now Global Plastic Watch, but how about scientific network? Is there any established within the country or within the region at least that you know of or you're part of?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we have the Malaysian Microplastics Network, which was funded under a British grant, but the project has run out and we have yet to decide really how we want to continue that network. So there was a collaboration with mostly UMT. So UMT had the hub in West Malaysia, and we in Sumban and Unimas were the East Malaysian hub. And we have moved this network to an ASEAN center now. So we are part of a new funding under the Japanese JST program, where we have colleagues from Japan and Thailand and the UK. So we are exchanging knowledge basically and starting to establish an ASEAN-wide network. So we learn the drone technology from them. We teach them the microplastics on the NIRED. We exchange our tech and then we try and standardize our methods. So we are developing guidelines for mangroves and coral reefs. That's part of our aim, at least. So we can have a common assessment for the different countries. There are obviously other larger in this associations like CFAS. CFAS promotes this NIRED technology as well. So they have labs across the planet. We have the Global Plastic Watch and the Global Marine Database. Yeah, there are some. I think there's that.
Yeah, that sounds promising. But as you highlighted, also a lot of work still in progress. So yeah, I mean, this is a very pertinent issue, and you're right. Also, lately, also we're in a lot of discussions looking at how to use technologies like that was impressive, the drone imageries and the detection of plastic. Using these computerized applications, like maybe AutoCAD or whatnot. But yeah, these are some of the technologies that we have to incorporate and then using sensors also. But then again, the earlier points that you highlighted of managing all of these waste at the source. Yeah? So this is another thing, and when you compare, like for example, Australia on how they manage waste before allowing them to end in our marine ecosystem, that would be one of the things that we should push for as well. Right? So maybe I cannot expect you and the team of scientists to solve that alone. And it is, as always, environmental issues are always a cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary issue to be that requires a lot of collaboration and co-working between agencies, organizations. And I saw this one question.
Can I add on that note? Actually,
yeah, please. Yes.
I mean, Malaysia has, I think, done quite a lot of policy development in recent years, and I think Cheryl is in the crowd. So if she's free, maybe she can comment, because she has been leading the guideline development for the Malaysian plastics road. I think the roadmap for Malaysian. I think there's a lot of effort on your end in dealing with this.
Yes, if Yeah, Shara, if you want to respond to that.
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks, Maurice, for the very interesting presentation. You've actually nailed exactly where the gap is, because like you mentioned, we've now got a national policy set with the action plan up to 2030. But one of the biggest gaps that we've seen is the inadequacy of baseline data, especially when you mention microplastics. When it comes to macro, there's still, snapshots of bits and pieces done by the various stakeholders. But microplastic is something that we have acknowledged to be lacking in that sense. At this point, I would say all these studies by the universities and those things that you've mentioned is going to be very crucial in supporting the implementation of the policy, because pillar 3 in the policy out of the 5 pillars mentions monitoring and assessment based on science towards managing this issue. So at one point, we are pretty excited that we are among the first ones in this region to have a policy on this issue, which is fantastic. It guides the national implementation, but at the same time, we acknowledge there are a lot more to be done to make sure that the policy is and the action plan is implemented well. On that note, also, I'd just like to share with you, we have got a series of interesting bits coming up also in the next months or so. We are coincidentally collaborating with Australia to discuss further, more in the management and policy levels, monitoring. How do we look into streamlining monitoring? So that's coming your way. Keep a lookout on MIMA website. We will be inviting all of you as well. So yeah, we acknowledge there are gaps in this issue. And even in the regional level, while the international communities are talking about the legal instrument, the regional discussions are very much focused into how do we compare data? Because here at national level, local levels is already different. Imagine regional level comparisons, even different, right? Everyone is using different methodologies and so on. So that was one gap that we saw, and we hope to fill some discussions to address that through this collaboration with Australia. So I was particularly excited when you showed that 2 maps with Australia there. Coincidentally, we've already established a partnership with them. So look forward to that, and I will be discussing further with you. In fact, I'll be reaching out in the time to come. Audrey, I will take a leave now to jump into another discussion. But thank you, Maurice. We'll be in touch.
Thank you very much, Shara, for the very important inputs. And this is why we have this a discussion also to bridge science into policy. Excuse me. And yes, I think that's good development on the policy side. Shara, thank you very much for sharing with us. And please do update us on the outcome. And of course, I mean, we cannot expect like solid or quick solution from that discussion alone, and it has to be continuous. And there's support from science. I mean, I cannot expect Moritz and his team alone. Yeah, so this is the time where we need to push also for more people, for more researchers to collaborate and to contribute. To solve this issue as big as this one, resources is very important also, and we've heard from Moritz himself, grants. I mean, cannot. I mean, they may not be able to support these kind of research for long term, right? But we know the pressure will be here for many more generations to come. So yeah, a lot of supports are needed, and of course, bridging it into policy will facilitate that. Yeah. So yes, we'll be in touch with you, Cheryl. Thank you very much for joining, and yeah, we welcome more questions from the crowd today. I may not be able to check on YouTube, but there are some questions actually on our chat. We received one from Malina. She's asking if have you come across on any information on the long-term effects of microplastics on humans? I think you briefly touched there, but maybe if you want to delve or to like explain a little bit further, Moritz.
Yes, I'm not a medical doctor, so I try and stay clear of the impact on humans, because I think it's a very touchy subject, and I don't know enough really to make a qualified comment, I think. From the studies I've seen, there are some who have shown that nanoplastics, when they break, microplastics breaks into nanoplastics, they can actually cross the cell barrier, the blood barrier. So I think there's a few studies that show that it's being taken up into our system. And there are some where they find then higher location. When you have a lot of microplastics or nanoplastics, there's a lot of irritation in the tissue and in the system. So there is definitely a potential for an impact, but I'm not sure how serious or long term is also hard to assess, because we only started talking about microplastics maybe 10-20 years ago. So it's a very new science. No, we have plastics only around for 70 years, I think, and then the science is only catching up now slowly. So long term impacts are hard to predict, I think, but that I think triggers a lot of the research, because we are seeing the impact in the lab, and we're seeing the potential down the line, because we have so much in the system already, and we worry that we can't control it anymore in the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, I can't really answer that in much detail.
Okay, yeah, we understand, and this actually is a good opportunity also to look at. I mean, like here's our chance to speak to our medical team. Yeah, that dissect bodies every day and find all of these evidence in humans body. Yeah? So I think this is a great opportunity also to link to another discipline to work on. And perhaps Malina, we're sorry we don't have any concrete information of that, but I think we've all of us came across a lot of news and updates and also new research. So perhaps we will try to bridge it later on with our colleagues in the medical line. I think we received some comments saying thank you to you for this very informative presentation. And I see Dr. Wan Juliana also here thanking many of us, thanking the US speaker. And continuing on from that discussion, Moritz, I mean, you did mention of some of the highlights or more crucial, critical topic to venture on. But would you expect support from perhaps, or maybe human resource support? How about it? Like do you have enough support? Like for example, students. I think this is an indicator of projecting of the long-term support to this niche research theme, if you like. How do you see it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, like you say, it's not something I can solve. So I think I do my part in my area, but I think there is generally a lot of interest in plastics, and we see many students taking up projects. We see many students looking at final year projects. So I think it's not an issue. We have NGOs popping up about beach cleaning. We have NGOs dealing with green waste management and so on. So I think that the issue of plastic is a very it's a very nice topic to deal with environmental issues, because it's very visible and people can understand quite easily, I think. So it's a nice story to work on. So I think plastic is definitely going to be hot for a few more years, I think. And the more we find out, probably the more questions we have.
Correct.
And I think
that's right. I think I agree with you because directly connected to us. So this is very important, and a lot of parties are helping in terms of cleaning up. Cleanup day is approaching also, I think, later on this year, and we will hear reports of how many kilograms and tons of plastic being collected. And the best part is they will collect more the next day. So it's a continuous issue. It's an issue of our generation, and I think we need to fix it. And yes, takers from the younger generation would be very helpful. And how about technologies? I mean, like you did mention about of instruments and lab facilities? Do we have enough in Malaysia, in Swinburne in particular?
You never have enough.
Yeah, there you go.
You always want more, obviously.
Yeah.
No, I think we have the basics. I don't think you need tech all the time. I mean, you can do a lot of good science without the best technology. Obviously, if you want to publish in Nature and Science and so on, if you care about the scientific publications, then yes, you need high-end tech. But you can still address very important questions, I think, without having the latest in tech. So, like this ller that we use is, for example, is more than accurate enough, and it works really fast and very quick, and it's very cheap. So it's basically just a camera setting with a light source and a stain. So everybody can build. We are creating the building instructions with the guys in the UK, so everybody can build their own set. And we have videos online where you can look at how to use it, and it's pretty straightforward. So even if I use it and somebody else uses it, we might get slightly different results, but at least we're using the same technology and we're working at the same level. So I think tech is not so much the issue. Tech will always evolve, and you always want more as a university. But I think we have enough tech to actually start looking at numbers and start making the efforts. Yeah. So it's more a question of funding to actually go out and do the surveys in many areas. I think not so much on the technology side.
Yeah, I saw the map just now. Sarawak is fairly, I mean, covered. Yeah, I mean, by your team, or maybe half of Sarawak coastline. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, surely I agree. We need more information and data on the ground. You did highlight of some of these solution on bacterial infestation on plastic. How far do you reckon, and how much more? I mean, prospect, right? I mean, like we're talking about prospect now. Like, how big will be? I mean, how big the impact that these bacterial infestation or microbes on plastic, and can it be a solid solution for at least localized microplastic within the mangrove system?
I think it's part of the solution. I think it addresses part of Hannah Rahim's question also. I think it's not just one thing. It's about knowing where they are. It's about knowing what is there actually. I mean, different plastics have different properties. So every plastic has to be treated differently as well. And so I think it's important to know where we find what and when. And then it's a combination of different issues. You have to educate the society to not waste so much, and then take better care of the waste. You have to have policies where you increase the recycling rate. You have to have policies where you avoid the use of technically challenging plastics if possible. And then you have a lot of different solutions, like collection, barrier, microbial remediation. There's a lot of chemical recycling as well. So I think there's not just one bucket that fits all. It's really a combination of all.
So surprising that you highlighted biodegradable plastic isn't I mean, like a powerful solution anyway.
No, maybe it is. I mean, we are not the only ones. There are actually a few other studies also who find that there are, it breaks down to microplastics faster. So maybe we are removing the macroplastics, but we create a bigger issue with the microplastics, which seem to have quite different properties from normal plastics. So it really is not so straightforward. I think it's a slightly more complex issue.
Yeah, I think maybe solve one problem, but it creates another problem. So thank you, Hannah, for your question. Maybe you want to further describe or further elaborate on that. Maybe more studies should be done to identify the occurrence of microplastic in different areas, or should we focus more on finding the solution? I think the basic still, as highlighted by Cheryl, in fact, earlier, that we still need continuous or research or identification on site, and perhaps also both. I think both sides, and it happens for any fundamental science topic or theme as well. I mean, including learning about mangrove. I mean, if you look at this group of plants behind me, we still need taxonomies. To work on each individual plants, and as well as we need people were studying on the management of these forests, on the habitat dynamics and so on and so forth. So yeah, it has to go in tandem, the fundamental research and the applied research as well. And I see actually Hannah raise your hand. Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to describe further or elaborate further on your question, or if you have any further question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the answer, because I felt so relieved, because actually I got the question when I told others that I'm doing the study on occurrence of microplastic. So some people ask if we really to check if the occurrence, or we should focus on the solution. So I really love the answer that we have to do both, and identifying the occurrence is also one of the solutions. So it's great to hear that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your support as well. And yeah, you're welcome to also share some of your work and findings through our network. I think you're part of our the MyMangrove Facebook group. So just but please do and just scream for help or assistance if you need someone to work with and or to assist you in the field or in the lab. Yeah, so this is our opportunity, and this network is meant for that, for us to exchange views, for us to exchange resources, and knowledge and understanding as well. So I think that's about it so far. Moritz, I'm pretty sure you will receive a lot of emails from now on. I think this is the same experience with our past speakers as well. So yeah, a lot of discussion post the seminar, so expect that. And also you will expect to hear from me a lot as well. I will ask a lot of questions also from now on, as usual. I will just call you in the middle of the night as and so thank you again. I think this is a very excellent discussion we had. I think although it is an issue, an ongoing issue, but I myself haven't really listened to it properly. And then I've seen, plastic in the mangrove, and I think you've seen some of my pictures I've shown of plastic occurrence in mangrove. And perhaps you didn't that references that you referred to perhaps describe or discuss some of the minor impact on mangrove. But then there are still, as you mentioned, also ongoing research on the impacts. Like, for example, one of the points I've highlighted before is how smothering plastic or plastic covering the soil will hinder recruitment of seedlings, for example, and that give a lot of impact for the mangrove to regenerate, to rejuvenate itself. So these are some of the things that are ongoing also on the ecological side, on the plant ecological side, on the habitat dynamics. And of course, that's very obvious, the one that you've highlighted, how it enters our system and our food chain. So a lot of things need to be discovered, need to be studied, and a lot of these will need to be communicated to the public as well. This is very critical issue, and I can't imagine if the public haven't seen it. Haven't digested this issue in their minds and their knowledge. And of course, politicians, please listen to this carefully. And this is a big issue, and I think it is an important issue to be addressed at all times, and not just election time. So I hope this message reaches the authorities as well. And thank you to the federal government, especially for coming up with a lot of approaches. I think guidelines, there are guidelines and roadmap as well on plastic issues and management. So I think a lot of follow-up must be carried out or taken to ensure all of these solid solution or management in particular of this issue. And please support the science. support the scientists, support all of our research through fundings or through other mechanisms that can be very helpful to many of us here. All right, so again, I would like to thank Professor Moritz for your time, for your precious time. I know it's hard to get you, although you chose, you were one of the first to actually agree to my invitation, and then you straight away selected July. I remember that moment because you wanted July, and then yeah, it's hard to get this date. But you're right, on the spot, it's 15th of July, so you're right in the middle of the month. So as we plan, so thank you very much again, Moritz. You will hear more from me. And if I may request, this is our like a usual stuff. If all of you can turn on your camera for a while, so we can have a photo taken with our distinguished speaker today. And yeah, while doing that, I would like to also thank everyone for participating in our Zoom session today, as well as on YouTube. So it will be available on our MyMangrove channel, for as long as it can be. So you can always refer to the conversation at any time. Yeah. So yeah, I guess many of them are too shy to turn on their camera. So let's, just the two of us. Then Moritz, smile. 1, 2, 3. Or maybe just hang in there.
Right. Thank you for having me, Audrey, and thanks for joining in, everybody. I think just to reach out to Hannah, if you have any issues, I'd be happy to collaborate, or anyone else. I think it is, like I said, it's not just one issue, it's one for many people. So yeah, if anyone wants to work or discuss or whatever, happy to talk.
Thank you
for
so
your
much.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I guess that's it for the July edition. And so next we will have so in the next speaker in line will be Associate Professor Dr. Siti Aisyah from University Malaya. So we will hear perhaps about fungi, about fungus in mangrove. But I haven't spoken to her on the exact topic. So stay tuned and wait for our announcement for the August edition of the MyMangrove Monthly Discourse. And again, thank you very much, Moritz, for your time and for the generous sharing on this issue. And we'll keep in touch. So to the rest, before I forget, July is very important for many of us. The 26th July will be celebrated. We will celebrate the International Day for the Conservation of the Mangrove Ecosystem. So stay tuned for so many events online and organized by many groups and parties. So stay tuned to announcements through our MyMangrove Facebook group, as well as share. Please do share some of the celebration or events happening in your place with all of us. So with that, again, signing off from this July 2022 MyMangrove Monthly Discourse. Take care and happy mangroving. Bye-bye.